I spent $2.5 million to buy silence, but what I received was the stench of cheap liquor and a foul betrayal in my own living room. When my sister called the police to evict me from my own home, she did not realize she was signing the death warrant for her lavish lifestyle. Blood is not a bond, it is just an excuse for parasites. Listen closely as I reclaim it all, every last cent. My name is Hannah Crestwood. I am 36 years old, and for the last decade, I have poured every ounce of my sanity and creative soul into the steel and glass foundations of Aetherist Design Group. As a lead architect, my life is measured in blueprints, zoning laws, and the relentless pressure of multi-million-dollar deadlines. After 18 months of grueling work on a skyscraper project in downtown Charlotte, I was a ghost of a woman. I was hollow, vibrating with a caffeine-induced anxiety that made my skin feel 2 sizes too small. I needed to disappear. I needed the kind of silence that you can only find at 4,000 feet above sea level, where the air is so thin and cold that it scours the lungs clean of city soot. That was why I was white-knuckling the steering wheel of my Range Rover, battling a blinding January blizzard as I ascended the treacherous, winding roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. The wipers were at their highest setting, slapping a rhythmic beat against the windshield as they fought back the heavy, wet flakes that threatened to swallow the world. I had spent $2.5 million on my mountain lodge 3 years ago. It was my sanctuary, a brutalist masterpiece of stone, cedar, and floor-to-ceiling glass tucked away on a private ridge where no one could find me unless I wanted to be found. I had designed every inch of it to be a fortress of solitude. My body ached with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 months straight to earn this 10-day hiatus. All I wanted was to kill the engine, step into the climate-controlled warmth of my foyer, pour a glass of my finest vintage, and stare at the snow until my brain stopped echoing with the demands of contractors and clients. The silence was supposed to be my reward, as I rounded the final sharp bend that led to my private driveway. The headlights cut through the gloom and hit something that made my heart skip a beat. There were cars, not just one, but several vehicles were parked haphazardly in the circular driveway, blocking the path to my garage. My pulse began to throb in my temples. At the front of the pack was a gleaming white luxury SUV, $65,000 vehicle that I knew all too well. I was the one who had signed the lease and was currently making the monthly payments of $850 because my younger sister, Elena, had claimed she needed a reliable car to keep her safe in the city. Next to it sat a mud-caked sedan and a battered pickup truck that looked entirely out of place against the sleek, modern lines of my estate. A cold, oily sensation of dread began to pool in my stomach. I had given Elena a key and the security code for emergencies only. A pipe burst, a forest fire, a break-in, those were the conditions. We had not spoken in 3 weeks, mostly because I had been too busy to answer her endless texts asking for another bridge loan to cover her husband's failing business ventures. I parked my car behind the pickup truck, my breath coming in short, jagged bursts. I stepped out into the biting wind, the snow instantly crusting on my eyelashes. The house, which should have been dark and dormant, was ablaze with light. Every single designer light fixture I had painstakingly selected was glowing, casting a sickly yellow hue onto the pristine snow. As I approached the heavy, hand-carved oak front door, I didn't even have to reach for my keys. The door was unlocked. The moment I pushed it open, I wasn't greeted by the scent of cedar and expensive candles. Instead, a wall of stale heat hit me, carrying the pungent, greasy odor of fried buffalo wings and cheap domestic beer. Loud, rhythmic bass from a pop song I detested was vibrating through the floorboards, rattling the custom-made glass partitions. My sanctuary had been breached. I walked into the foyer, my boots leaving wet, muddy tracks on the white Carrara marble floor, a floor that required specialized cleaning. I didn't care. My eyes were fixed on the living room. It looked like a fraternity house after a midterm bender. There were empty pizza boxes stacked on my mid-century modern coffee table, and several half-eaten plates of food were discarded on the white linen sofa. And then I saw her. Elena was lounging in my favorite Eames chair, her feet propped up on the matching ottoman. She was wearing my $300 silk and cashmere bathrobe, the one I had treated myself to after the last project wrapped, in her hand. She held a crystal glass, not just any glass, but one from a set of hand-blown tumblers I had imported from Italy. Inside it swirled a dark, deep crimson liquid. I recognized the label on the bottle sitting on the floor beside her. It was a 1994 vintage Cabernet from my private cellar. A bottle I had been aging for 5 years and was worth at least $1,200 on its own. Elena took a slow, theatrical sip. Her lips stained a bruised purple by the expensive wine. She looked up and saw me, but there was no guilt in her expression. There was only a fleeting shadow of irritation, as if I were a telemarketer calling during dinner. Sitting on the large sectional sofa were 5 other people. Grant, Elena's husband, was sprawled out with a beer in his hand, his muddy boots resting directly on the upholstery. Next to him were his parents, a couple who had always looked at me with a mix of envy and suspicion, and his 2 younger brothers, who were currently arguing over a video game they had hooked up to my 80-inch television. 7 people, an entire clannish, parasitic ecosystem had moved into my home. "Hannah," Grant said, his voice slurred and overly familiar. "You are back early. We thought you were stuck in the city until at least Tuesday." Elena didn't even stand up. She adjusted the collar of my robe and leaned back, her eyes cold and defiant. She looked at me as if I were the intruder, as if my presence were a rude interruption to the life she had stolen. The house felt crowded, dirty, and loud. The uphall of human chaos had completely extinguished the peace I had traveled 500 miles to find, but it was the fireplace that finally broke me. I had designed the hearth to be the emotional center of the home. Above the mantel, I had hung a large, professional portrait of our parents, taken a year before the car accident that took them from us. It was the only thing in this house that made it feel like a home rather than an architectural gallery. I looked up at the mantel and felt the air leave my lungs. My parents were gone. The frame had been taken down and leaned against the wall in a dark corner, hidden behind a stack of firewood. In its place was a gaudy, oversized family photo of Grant's family, his parents, his brothers, and Elena, all smiling toothy, manufactured smiles in front of a generic studio backdrop. They had literally erased my history to install their own. I stood there, shivering in my snow-dusted coat, my hands trembling with a rage so white-hot it felt like ice. I looked at the wine stains on my rug, the grease on my sofa, the strangers in my chairs, and the stolen robe on my sister's back. My mind, usually so calculated and orderly, narrowed down to a single, sharp point of intent. The silence I wanted was gone, replaced by the ugly noise of betrayal. But as I stared at Elena's smug, wine-stained face, I realized that I didn't want peace anymore. I wanted a different kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a total, scorched earth destruction. "You shouldn't have touched the portrait." "Elena," I whispered, though my voice was drowned out by the thumping bass of the music. She just laughed, a shrill, entitled sound that echoed off the cold stone walls. "What is the big deal?" "Hannah, it is just a house. We are family. You have everything, and we have nothing. Don't be so dramatic." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of my phone. The architect in me knew that when a structure is infested with rot, you don't try to patch the walls, you tear it down to the studs and start over. And I was about to be the most ruthless demolition expert they had ever met. Elena set her glass down on the side table with a sharp click, her eyes narrowing as if I were a smudge on a lens she was trying to look through. There was no color in her cheeks from shame, only the flush of the $1,200 wine and the warmth of a fire she hadn't built. She adjusted the lapels of my cashmere robe, pulling it tighter around her as if she were the rightful sovereign of this mountain ridge, and I was merely a wandering beggar who had lost her way in the storm. The air in the room, thick with the smell of grease and stale beer. Felt like it was curdling around us. "You have got to be kidding me," Elena said, her voice dripping with a calculated, poisonous irritation. Her tone wasn't one of a sister caught red-handed. It was the tone of a homeowner whose peace had been disturbed by a persistent solicitor. "You parasite. Did you actually follow us all the way up here? I cannot believe how desperate you are for attention. Get out right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing on a private vacation." The word parasite hit me with more force than the mountain wind. It was so absurd, so diametrically opposed to the reality of our lives, that for a second, I felt the world tilt. I had spent the last 15 years of my life building a career that required absolute precision, where a single inch of error in a blueprint could lead to a structural catastrophe. I lived in a world of hard facts and cold steel. Yet here stood my sister, a woman who hadn't worked a full 40-hour week in her entire life, calling me the leech. I didn't scream. I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I let my gaze wander away from her distorted face and down to the floor. Right there, near the leg of the coffee table, was a dark, jagged stain on my custom-woven silk rug. It was an antique piece I had commissioned from a weaver in Virginia, costing me nearly $8,000. Someone had spilled buffalo wing sauce on it and tried to rub it out with a damp cloth, only succeeding in grinding the orange grease deeper into the delicate fibers. I looked at the stain, then back at Elena. "That rug is handmade silk," I said, my voice as flat as a sheet of industrial glass. "It is ruined." Elena rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "Oh, for the love of God. Hannah, stop being so obsessive. It is just a piece of carpet. This is exactly why I told everyone you were having a breakdown. You care more about inanimate objects than you do about your own flesh and blood. You are pathetic, stalking us on a family holiday because you have nobody else in your life." Grant stood up then, towering over the sofa with a beer bottle clutched in his hand. He was wearing a flannel shirt that probably cost more than his weekly paycheck, likely bought with the credit card I paid off every month. He put a protective arm around Elena's shoulders, looking down at me with a mix of pity and manufactured authority that made my skin crawl. "Look, Hannah," Grant said, his voice deep and patronizing. "We really did not want it to come to this. We came up here to get some space, to give my parents a nice holiday away from the stress of the city. You said we could use the place. You gave Elena the keys. Now you show up unannounced, acting like a crazy person because of a rug. You need to show some respect for our family's private time. This is our space for the week. You are making everyone uncomfortable." His parents, who had been watching the exchange from the sectional, finally chimed in. Grant's father, a man who had spent 30 years in mid-level management and still acted like he ran a Fortune 500 company, nodded sternly. "He is right," the older man said, gesturing with a half-eaten chicken bone. "Elena was very clear that you lent her this lodge because you were going to be overseas for a business trip. We were invited here as guests. It is quite rude of you to barge in and start accusing people of things if you are having a hard time emotionally. That is one thing, but don't take it out on your sister. She has been a saint, trying to keep us away from your drama." I looked at their faces, one by one. I saw the absolute certainty in their eyes. They truly believed the lie. Elena hadn't just broken into my house, she had constructed an entire alternate reality for these people. In her version of the story, she was the wealthy, generous benefactor, and I was the unstable, lonely sister, who was so desperate for a connection that I had basically surrendered my property to her out of some twisted sense of guilt. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, a structural deception that would have been impressive if it weren't so disgusting. I looked at the portrait of Grant's family sitting on my mantel, where my parents' faces should have been. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They hadn't just moved in. They had attempted to rebrand the very soul of the house. "Elena," I said, stepping further into the room, my wet boots squeaking on the hardwood, "I never told you that you could use this house for a party. I never told you that you could bring 7 people here to trash my property and drink my wine. I gave you that emergency code for one reason, in case of a fire or a flood while I was away, not so you could play house with your in-laws." Elena let out a short, sharp laugh. "Stop lying." "Hannah, you are just mad because you saw how happy we are without you. You literally texted me 3 days ago saying, 'Have fun at the lodge. I am heading to Europe.'" "I have the messages." She reached for her phone, tapping the screen with an aggressive flourish. I knew there were no such messages. I hadn't texted her in weeks. But she didn't show the phone to me. She showed it to Grant's mother, who gasped and shook her head in disapproval. "It is so sad," the mother whispered, "to be so jealous of your own sister that you would lie about a text message." The level of commitment to the lie was staggering. Elena was banking on the fact that I was too dignified to create a scene, that I would simply retreat into the snow and deal with it later. She thought she could bully me in my own home by using the weight of a family that wasn't even mine. She thought my silence was weakness. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. The architectural side of my brain took over. The part that dealt with stress loads and shear force. I realized that if I argued with them, I was just another actor in her play. If I tried to prove she was lying, she would just scream louder. To win this, I had to change the medium of the conflict. I had to move from the world of he said, she said, into the world of cold, hard evidence. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I didn't open my messages or my call logs. I didn't try to defend myself. I simply swiped down to the voice memos app. "What are you doing?" Elena snapped, her eyes darting to the device in my hand. "Are you calling your therapist? Because you really should. You are acting like a total lunatic." I didn't answer her. I tapped the large red button on the screen. The counter began to tick 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I held the phone up, making sure the screen was visible to everyone in the room. "I am recording this conversation," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the steel-edged tone I used when I had to fire a contractor who was cutting corners on a foundation. "Grant, you just stated on the record that I gave you permission to be here. Elena, you just claimed I sent you a text message 3 days ago saying I was going to Europe. You also called me a parasite and told me to get out of my own house." Grant laughed, but it was a nervous sound, a thin vibration in the air. "So what? You think a recording matters. We are your family. Hannah, you can't record us without our consent. That is illegal. Actually, North Carolina is a one-party consent state," I replied, stepping closer until I was standing right at the edge of the ruined rug. "And since I am a party to this conversation and I am standing in a home that I own, I have every right to record the people who have broken into it. Everything you say from this moment forward is being documented." Elena's face transformed. The smug, wine-drunk satisfaction vanished, replaced by a sharp, jagged mask of pure malice. She stood up from the Eames chair, the silk robe fluttering around her legs. She looked like she wanted to lung at me, but the sight of the recording phone held her back. "You think you are so smart, don't you?" she hissed. "You think because you have a fancy job and a big bank account, you can just treat us like garbage. You have always been like this, cold, controlling. You hated that I married Grant. You hated that I have a real family and you have nothing but these cold stone walls. We are staying here. Hannah, it is Christmas. No judge in the world is going to side with a bitter, lonely woman who tries to kick her pregnant sister out into a blizzard." I paused, my thumb hovering over the recording. Pregnant Grant's mother stood up, her face twisted with indignation. "Yes, she is 3 months along, and you are here stressing her out. How can you be so heartless? You should be ashamed of yourself." I looked at Elena. I knew she wasn't pregnant. We had seen each other a month ago, and she had been drinking martinis like they were water, complaining about how Grant wanted kids, but she didn't want to ruin her figure. This was just another layer of the foundation she was building, a layer made of straw and lies. I didn't argue. I didn't call her a liar. I just kept the phone recording. 3 months, I repeated, nodding slowly. "That is very interesting. I am sure the police will find that detail very compelling when they arrive to escort you off the premises. Because while you were busy telling your in-laws how rich you are, you forgot one very important thing about this house. What Elena spat, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and the first real cracks of fear. I looked up at the corner of the ceiling, where a small, unobtrusive black dome was mounted. It was a high-definition security camera with night vision and audio recording, one of 12 scattered throughout the property. This house is a smart home prototype. I said, everything, the lights, the locks, the cameras is linked to a cloud server. I have footage of the exact moment you entered this house. I have audio of you bragging to Grant about how you tricked the old bat into giving you the code. And I have every single second of you and your family trashing my living room for the last 48 hours. The silence that followed was absolute. The pop music had stopped moments ago, leaving only the sound of the wind howling against the glass. Grant's parents looked at the camera, then at each other, the first shadows of doubt finally crossing their faces. Grant himself looked like he was about to vomit. I am going to give you exactly 5 minutes to get out of my robe, pack your bags, and get every single person in this room out of my house. I said, my voice ringing out like a gavel in a silent courtroom. If you are still here at the end of those 5 minutes, I am not just calling the police for trespassing. I am pressing charges for breaking and entering, grand larceny of my wine cellar, and property damage. And Elena, I will make sure the police see the text messages you claimed I sent. I am sure they will be fascinated by your forgery skills. Elena didn't move. She stood there, clutching the Italian crystal glass so hard I thought it would shatter. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a predatory, cornered animal energy. You wouldn't, she whispered. We are sisters. I looked at the stain on the rug. I looked at the family portrait of strangers on my mantel. I looked at the empty bottle of wine that had been waiting for a special occasion, that she had turned into a cheap party trick. We were sisters. I corrected her. But like you said, I am just a parasite in your life, right? And I have decided it is time for the host to stop feeding you. I turned the phone around so she could see the timer. 4 minutes and 45 seconds left. Elena, I suggest you start moving. The flickering orange light from the fireplace, the same one I had meticulously designed to be a symbol of warmth and stability, now felt like a taunt. As I stood there holding my phone, watching the seconds tick away on my recording, the sheer weight of the last 5 years began to press down on my chest like a physical mountain of stone. I looked at Elena, who was still clutching my crystal glass with white-knuckled intensity, and for a fleeting second, I didn't see the bitter, entitled woman standing before me. I saw a scared 10-year-old girl standing at our mother's funeral, her hand trembling in mine. I could still hear my mother's voice, frail and thinned out by the cancer that had hollowed her out in less than 6 months. She had grabbed my wrist in that sterile hospital room, her eyes wide with a frantic, dying desperation. Hannah, she had whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint and decay. Promise me you will take care of Elena. She is not strong like you. She is weak, and she needs you. Please, do not let her go astray. I had spent over 60 months trying to honor that dying wish, and in doing so, I had effectively funded the destruction of my own boundaries. I looked at the luxury brand bathrobe Elena was wearing and remembered the $4,500 I had spent just last month to cover the rent on their 2-bedroom apartment in the city. I had been paying that rent for 3 years straight. I had told myself it was a temporary bridge while Grant got his investment firm off the ground, but the truth was far uglier. Grant's investment firm was nothing more than a series of glossy brochures and a rented mahogany desk that I also paid for. He was an unemployed ghost, a man who spent his days at expensive golf clubs, networking with other people who actually had money, while he billed every lunch and every cocktail to the secondary credit card I had foolishly provided to Elena for emergencies. That word emergency had been the poison in our relationship. For Elena, an emergency was a half-off sale at a designer boutique or a weekend getaway to the Hamptons that she felt she deserved because she was stressed. I realize now, with a clarity that felt like a surgical incision, that the emergency key code I had given her for this lodge hadn't been a safety net. It had been an invitation for her to feast on the life I had built. She hadn't just used the key, she had moved in and changed the locks of my own family history. I looked over at Grant's parents, who were still sitting on my sofa with expressions of offended dignity. Martha, Grant's mother, was smoothing out the wrinkles in her skirt. Her lips pursed as if she were waiting for me to apologize for existing. "I have a question for you, Martha," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "How exactly did Elena explain her ownership of this property to you? Did she tell you she bought it with her own money?" Martha looked at Elena, then back at me, her chin lifting in defiance. "She told us she made a series of incredibly smart cryptocurrency investments 2 years ago. She said she wanted to surprise us all with a family retreat that she built from the ground up using her own architectural vision. She even showed us the blueprints." I almost laughed. "The blueprints she showed you were likely the ones I left on the dining table in the city 6 months ago when I was finalizing the deck renovations. Elena didn't build this. She couldn't even tell you the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative partition. I paid $2,500,000 for this land and the construction. Every nail, every pane of glass, and every drop of vintage wine in that cellar was earned through my 80-hour work weeks, while she was busy spending $20,000 a year on skincare and yoga retreats that I also subsidized." Grant stepped forward, his face a mottled shade of red. "Shut up. Hannah, just shut up. You are so obsessed with money. It is disgusting. Elena is your sister. She is family. What is yours should be hers. That is how a real family works. We didn't break in. We are just using what you weren't using anyway. You are always at the office, burying yourself in your work because you have no soul. We are the ones who actually know how to live." The arrogance was staggering. It wasn't just that they were using my house. It was that they truly believed they were entitled to it because I was successful, and they were not. They viewed my hard work as a communal pool of resources that they had a divine right to drain. I looked at the parents-in-law again. "I want you to understand something very clearly. I did not lend this house to anyone. This is not a vacation rental. This is my sanctuary, and you are currently participating in a criminal act. I have spent the last 5 years being the silent bank for your son's failures and your daughter-in-law's delusions. I have paid out over $300,000 in rent, car payments, and credit card debt for them. I did it because of a promise I made to a dead woman. But that promise didn't include allowing my sister to turn me into a stranger in my own home." Elena's face twisted. The mask of the grieving, pregnant sister was slipping, revealing a jagged, ugly entitlement underneath. "You think you are so much better than us," she hissed. "You think you can just show up and ruin everything. You are the one who is lonely. Hannah, you have your millions and your cold modern houses, but you have no one. We are the only family you have, and you are about to lose us." "I am not losing a family," I said, the words feeling remarkably light as they left my mouth. "I am removing a tumor." Elena stared at me for a long beat, her chest heaving under the silk robe. Then, a slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across her face. It was the smile of someone who had practiced being a victim for so long that she had started to believe her own performance. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone. "Fine," she said, her voice eerily light. "If you want to play the legal game, let's play. You think those cameras and that recording make you the winner? I am the one who is pregnant. I am the one whose sister just barged in and started threatening an entire family in the middle of a blizzard. I am the one who is terrified for my life." She didn't hesitate. Her thumb moved with a practiced, predatory speed. I watched in a sort of detached horror as she dialed 911. "Hello?" she said into the phone, her voice instantly transforming into a high-pitched, trembling sob that would have won her an Oscar if it weren't so vile. "Yes, I need help. I am at my mountain home in the Blue Ridge district. My sister just broke in. She is armed with, I don't know. She is screaming and threatening us. She is being violent. I am 3 months pregnant and I'm so scared. Please, Please send someone before she hurts my family. Yes. The address is 1245 Ridgeline Way. Please hurry. She disconnected the call and looked at me, her eyes sparkling with a sick, triumphant glow. She actually laughed. A low, guttural sound. The police are 20 minutes away. Hannah. And when they get here, they are going to see a pregnant woman in her own home, surrounded by her loving family, being harassed by a bitter, single woman who doesn't even have a key on her because she forgot it. Who do you think they are going to believe, your smart home app, or the woman crying for the life of her unborn child? I stood perfectly still. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had settled into a cold, steady rhythm. I realized that Elena had spent her entire life observing my strengths and weaknesses, and she had decided that my biggest weakness was my fear of public scandal and my desire to keep our mother's memory untarnished. She thought she could weaponize the law against the person who provided her with everything. I looked at Grant, who was now nodding in agreement with his wife, and at his parents, who looked satisfied that the problem was being handled. They were all in on it. They were a pack of wolves who had found a warm den and were prepared to kill the owner to keep it. You really did it, I said, more to myself than to her. You actually called the emergency services to report a crime that you are currently committing. I did, Elena whispered, leaning in close, the scent of my $1,200 wine heavy on her breath. And you are going to walk out of that door right now. Leave your car keys on the table and drive away in that pickup truck if you don't want to spend the night in a cell. This is my house now. Hannah, it has been for a long time. You were just too busy working to notice. I didn't move toward the door. I didn't reach for my car keys. Instead, I looked up at the security camera in the corner of the room, the little blue light blinking like a steady digital heartbeat. I knew that every word she had just said, every fake sob, and every admission of her plan was being uploaded in real time to a secure server that she couldn't touch. I looked at my watch. It was 10:45 on Christmas Eve. The blizzard was howling outside, the wind shaking the massive glass panes of the living room. It was the perfect night for a disaster. I hope you are ready. Elena, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Because you didn't just call the police. You called for the end of everything you have ever known. You think you can build a life on a foundation of lies and theft? I am an architect. I know exactly how long a structure like that lasts before it collapses under its own weight. I walked over to the dining table, pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs, and sat down. I crossed my legs and looked at the family portrait of Grant's parents hanging over my mantel. I am not going anywhere. I said, I think I will stay and watch the show. After all, I paid for it. The silence that followed Elena's frantic call was more oppressive than the music had been. For 20 minutes, we sat in a tableau of mutual hatred, the only sound being the crackle of the fire and the occasional hiss of a melting snowflake against the window. Grant's parents sat on the edge of my ruined sofa like royalty waiting for a coronation, their faces set in masks of self-righteous indignation. Elena stayed in my robe, her eyes fixed on the door, her fingers twitching with a nervous, manic energy. She thought she had won. She truly believed that in the eyes of the law. The woman with the loudest sob would be granted the crown. Then, the world outside turned into a kaleidoscope of red and blue. The emergency lights of the Watauga County Sheriff's vehicles cut through the blizzard, reflecting off the thick glass and painting the living room in the colors of a crime scene. 2 deputies stepped out into the knee-deep snow, their silhouettes dark and hulking against the white void. I watched them through the floor-to-ceiling windows, noting the professional weight of their gait. They weren't coming for a holiday chat. They were coming to resolve a reported violent intrusion. When the heavy thud of the oak door echoed through the house, Grant jumped up to open it, his chest puffed out with a false sense of bravery. "Thank God you are here," he said, his voice cracking slightly as 2 deputies, one tall with a weathered face, the other younger and more alert, stepped into the foyer. Elena didn't wait for them to ask questions. She threw herself toward the officers, the silk of my robe billowing behind her. She didn't quite touch them, but she got close enough to let her manufactured tears fall onto the marble floor. "Please, you have to help us," she wailed, her voice hitting a pitch of desperation that was almost impressive. This woman. She just barged in. She is my sister, but she is not well. She has been stalking us for months. She started screaming, threatening my husband, threatening my unborn baby. We are just trying to have a peaceful Christmas, and she is terrifying my in-laws. Please, get her out of here before she does something she cannot take back. The older deputy, whose name tag read Miller, looked around the room. He saw the empty wine bottles, the grease stains, the 7 people sprawled across a house that looked like a high-end furniture showroom. Then he looked at me. I was still sitting in the leather dining chair, my coat still on, my hands folded neatly on the table. I didn't look like a woman having a psychotic break. I looked like a woman waiting for a meeting to start, Ma'am, Deputy Miller said, looking at me. Is this your sister? She is, I said, my voice calm and resonant, cutting right through Elena's whimpering. And do you have a reason for being here tonight, the younger deputy? Vance asked, his hand resting near his belt as his eyes scanned the room for weapons. I have the best reason in the world. Officer, I replied, I own the place. Elena let out a sharp, mocking laugh that turned into a sob. That is the delusion I was talking about. She thinks everything I have belongs to her. She is obsessed with my success. Tell them. Grant, tell them whose house this is. It is ours, Grant said, stepping forward, his voice dripping with a simulated bravado. My wife bought this through her investment firm, Etheris Ridge Holdings. We have been here for days. This woman just showed up with a key she must have stolen from our mother's house. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't even look at Elena. I reached down and picked up my professional leather briefcase that I had carried in from the car. I placed it on the dining table and flipped the latches. The sound of the metal clicking open was as sharp as a gunshot in the silent room. I am a lead architect at Etheris Design Group, I said, addressing Deputy Miller directly. I don't know what Etheris Ridge Holdings is, but I suspect it is a name my sister made up 5 minutes ago because she knows who I work for. I am a very organized woman. Deputy, I never travel without my essential files, especially when I'm planning to spend 10 days at my secondary residence. I pulled out a thick, clear folder. Elena's eyes widened, and for the first time, the triumphant glow in her expression began to flicker. Inside this folder, I said, pulling out the first document, is the original deed for this property, dated 3 years ago. It shows the purchase price of $2,500,000. Paid in full by Hannah Crestwood. Here is the title insurance. Here is the most recent property tax receipt from Watauga County, also in my name. And here, most importantly, is my North Carolina driver's license, which matches the name on every single one of these documents. I handed the stack to Deputy Miller. He took out a small flashlight and began to cross-reference the papers with my ID. The room went unnervingly quiet. I could hear Grant's father shift in his seat, the leather of the sofa creaking under his weight. Elena was frozen. Her mouth was slightly open, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She looked like a gambler who had just realized the deck was stacked against her. Deputy Miller looked up from the papers, his expression turning from professional neutrality to a cold, hard skepticism. He handed the documents to his partner and then turned his gaze toward Grant and Elena. Ma'am, he said to Elena, his voice dropping an octave. You told dispatch that you were the owner of this residence. Do you have any documentation to back that up? A lease, a deed. Even a utility bill in your name, Elena stammered, her eyes darting toward Grant. Well, it is all digital. Grant handles the paperwork. Grant, tell him Grant cleared his throat, his face turning a sickly, pale gray. Well, you see, the thing is, the closing was very recent. The paperwork might still be in processing. We are in the middle of a complex tax shelter transfer. Deputy Miller didn't look impressed. Mr. Crestwood, I mean. Mr. Hayes, there is no such thing as a processing deed that allows you to claim ownership over a property that is clearly titled to another individual, especially an individual who is standing right here with the original wet signature documents. Grant's father stood up, his face a mix of confusion and burgeoning anger. "Now, hold on a minute, officer. My daughter-in-law told us she built this place. She invited us here. We drove 6 hours through a storm because she said she wanted to host the family in her new lodge. Are you telling me she doesn't own this?" I looked at the older man. "She doesn't own a single splinter of wood in this house. Arthur, she doesn't even own the car you saw in the driveway. I am the one who has been paying the $850 a month for that SUV for the last 2 years. I am the one who pays for the apartment they live in. I am the host of this party, and I was never invited." The realization hit the room like a physical blow. I watched the faces of Grant's brothers, the 2 boys who had been playing games on my television. They looked down at their controllers as if they were suddenly red hot. Grant's mother, Martha, looked like she was about to faint. She turned to Elena, her voice a low, horrified hiss. "Elena, you lied to us. You told us you were a millionaire. You told us Hannah was a charity case you were helping out. You brought us here." "To a house that isn't yours," Elena finally snapped. She stopped crying. The pregnant victim vanished, and the snarling, cornered animal returned. "So what?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "She has 5 houses. She is never even here. Why should she get to have all of this while we struggle? We are family. We had every right to be here." Deputy Vance stepped forward, his expression stern. "No, ma'am. You did not. In the state of North Carolina, entering a property without the owner's consent and refusing to leave is a crime, given that you misrepresented yourself to emergency dispatch and attempted to have the rightful owner removed from her own property under false pretenses. We are looking at a very serious situation here." The deputy turned to me. "Miss Crestwood, how would you like to proceed? This is a clear case of first-degree trespassing. We can remove them immediately, or we can take them into custody if you wish to press charges for the fraudulent 911 call." All eyes turned to me. The power in the room had shifted entirely. I was no longer the lonely sister or the parasite. I was the architect of their immediate future. I looked at Grant's parents. They were good people in their own limited way, but they had been blinded by greed and the desire to believe their son had finally made something of himself. Now, they were standing in a stranger's living room, surrounded by police, realizing they were accomplices to a crime. "I want them out," I said, my voice ringing with a finality that brooked no argument. "Every single one of them. I want them to pack their things and leave my property right now. If they are not gone in 30 minutes, I want them arrested." Grant's mother began to sob real tears this time, tears of shame. "Oh, God," she whispered. "We are going to be arrested. Arthur, do something." Arthur looked at his son, then at Elena, with a look of such profound disgust that I almost felt a flicker of pity for them. He didn't say a word to me. He just walked over to the sofa, grabbed his coat, and looked at his other 2 sons. "Get your things," he commanded. "We are leaving." "But Dad, it is a blizzard," Grant yelled, his voice sounding like a panicked child. "We can't drive down the mountain in this. The roads are suicide." "Then you should have thought about that before you broke into your sister-in-law's house and lied to your parents." Arthur snapped. Elena stood in the center of the room, clutching my silk robe, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you are so powerful, don't you? Hannah, you think because you have the law on your side today, you have won, you are still going to be alone tomorrow. You are still going to be the woman who kicked her pregnant sister out into a storm on Christmas Eve." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers with a cold, architectural precision. "You are not pregnant, Elena. We both know that. And as for being alone, I would rather be alone in the silence of this mountain than spend one more second sharing my life with a thief who calls me a parasite while she eats my food and drinks my wine." I turned to Deputy Miller. "Please supervise them. I don't want a single one of my belongings leaving this house in their bags. And please ensure that my sister returns my bathrobe before she steps out into that snow. I wouldn't want her to take something else that doesn't belong to her." The look on Elena's face as she had to untie the silk robe in front of the police and her in-laws, shivering in her cheap t-shirt and leggings, was the first payment on a debt that had been accruing for 5 long years. It was a small payment, but it was just the beginning. The storm was still howling outside, but as I watched Grant's family start to scramble, the air in the house finally started to feel clean again. The rot was being removed, the foundation was being cleared, and I was just getting started with the demolition. I didn't watch them as they began to move. I didn't need to see the frantic, clumsy way Grant shoved half-eaten food aside to reach for his suitcase, or the way Elena stood shivering in her thin leggings, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. I walked past the mess on the coffee table and sat down in the center of the large sectional sofa. It was the seat Grant had occupied with such unearned arrogance only an hour ago. Now, it was my command center. Deputy Miller and Deputy Vance stood by the foyer, their arms crossed, their presence a silent, heavy weight that ensured the chaos remained orderly. They were the muscle, but I was the one holding the scalpel. "Keep an eye on them, deputies," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I want to make sure they only leave with what they brought. My sister has a habit of confusing my property with her own." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face with a cold, blue light that felt far more natural to me than the warm, deceitful glow of the fireplace. In the world of architecture, we have a saying that the smallest fracture in a foundation will eventually bring down the entire skyscraper. Elena and Grant had been living in a penthouse built on a foundation of my goodwill, and I was about to trigger the controlled demolition. I used my face to unlock the device. I didn't open social media or my messages. I went straight to the Aethirus Wealth Portal, a high-security asset management application I used to oversee my various holdings. I tapped on the tab labeled Residential Properties. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through the sound of Grant's heavy breathing as he struggled with a zipper. "I want you to hear exactly how your world ends." Elena stopped. She was holding a pile of discarded clothes, her face pale and streaked with mascara. She looked at the phone in my hand as if it were a detonator. "First," I said, my thumb hovering over a digital button, "the apartment on East 79th Street, the 2-bedroom unit in the Upper East Side where you have lived rent-free for 36 months. That is my home," Elena shrieked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You can't touch that. My name is on the mailbox. I didn't even look up. Your name is on a piece of plastic by the buzzer." "Elena, but the lease is held by Crestwood Holdings Limited Liability Company. I am the sole officer of that company. Since you have failed to pay the agreed maintenance fee of $0 for 3 years, and since I am no longer interested in providing you with a stage for your lies, I am clicking the terminate button right now." I tapped the screen. A small green checkmark appeared. An automated email was instantly dispatched to the building's management and my legal team. "The formal eviction notice will be served at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I continued, "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises before the locks are changed and your belongings are moved to a storage unit in New Jersey." "You are a monster," Elena yelled, dropping her clothes and taking a step toward me. "Grant, tell her she can't do this." Grant didn't say a word. He was looking at his own phone, likely seeing the same notifications I was generating. I didn't stop. I swiped left on the screen, moving to the Financial Services tab. "Next," I said, "the secondary credit card. The one with the $10,000 monthly limit that I so graciously provided for emergencies." Grant's head snapped up. "Hannah, wait. We have bills. We have the car payment. You can't just cut us off in the middle of a storm." I looked him in the eye. "I am not cutting you off. Grant, I am liberating you. You wanted to be a man of means. Now you get to find out what things actually cost. I am currently setting the credit limit to $0. Effective immediately." I swiped the digital slider all the way to the left. A red notification popped up on the screen. "Card suspended." I watched Grant's face as he received the text alert. It was the look of a man who had just realized the parachute he was wearing was actually a backpack full of rocks. "Then there is the matter of the white luxury SUV parked in my driveway," I said, my voice dropping into a low conversational tone. The one I pay $850 a month for. The one I have paid over $20,000 toward in interest and principal. Elena started to shake. You gave that to me. That was a birthday present. Elena, I let you use it. The title is in my name, the insurance is in my name, and the GPS tracker is linked to this phone. I am currently sending a repossession instruction to the finance company. If that vehicle is not returned to the dealership in Charlotte by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, I will report it as stolen, and given that the police are already here to witness this warning, I don't think you want to test that theory. Grant's father, Arthur, walked into the living room. He looked like he had aged a decade in the last half hour. He looked at the phone in my hand, then at his son. Is this true? Grant, he asked, his voice thick with a crushing disappointment. Everything, the apartment, the car, the money, none of it was yours. Grant looked at the floor. He couldn't even meet his father's eyes. He looked like a small, hollow shell of a man. Elena, however, wasn't done. She turned her venom on me again. You think you are so powerful with your little apps, she spat. You think money is everything. You are still going to be alone. You are still going to have no one to share this big, empty house with. I am perfectly fine with being alone. Elena, I said, tapping the screen one last time to open the loan guarantor section, because being alone is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who view my life as a buffet. And speaking of sharing, let's talk about Grant's personal business loan. Grant froze. Hannah, don't. That is between me and the bank. It was, I agreed. Until you asked me to sign as a guarantor so you could get that $500,000 line of credit for your investment firm. The one you told me was backed by 99% collateral. I did some checking last week. Grant, your collateral is non-existent. You have been using that money to fund your lifestyle and pay the interest on other debts. I looked at the deputies, then back at my screen. As of this moment, I am withdrawing my status as guarantor. Under the terms of the agreement, the bank will trigger a mandatory recall of the full balance within 24 hours due to a loss of financial backing. Grant's knees actually buckled. He sank onto the edge of the sofa, the beer bottle in his hand tilting precariously. That will ruin me. He whispered, I will go bankrupt. I stood up from the sofa. The digital execution was complete. In the span of 10 minutes, I had stripped away the facade they had spent years constructing. I had removed the stolen robes, the stolen cars, and the stolen homes. I looked at Martha, Grant's mother, who was clutching a small bag of her belongings. She looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated shame. I am so sorry. Hannah, she whispered. We didn't know. We truly didn't know that they were doing this to you. I believe you. Martha, I said, and for a moment, my voice softened. But you should ask your son why he felt it was necessary to build a life out of my skin. I turned back to the room, my eyes cold once more. 30 minutes. I reminded them, the clock is ticking, and since your credit cards no longer work, I suggest you find a very cheap motel that takes cash, or better yet, maybe Elena can use some of those smart investments she told you about. I walked toward the kitchen, leaving them to the silence of their own ruin. I could hear the sounds of bags being zipped and low, bitter arguments breaking out among them. The pack was already turning on itself. Without the meat I provided, the wolves were getting hungry. I went to the counter and poured myself a glass of water, just plain. Cold water. I stood there, looking out the window at the swirling white abyss of the storm. The red and blue lights of the police cars were still flashing, casting a rhythmic pulse over the snow. I felt a strange sense of architectural satisfaction. When you find a structural flaw this deep, there is only one thing to do. You don't try to save the building. You ensure the collapse is total so that the ground can be cleared for something new. My name is Hannah Crestwood, and for the first time in 5 years, I was no longer an unpaid bank. I was just an architect standing in her own home, listening to the beautiful, cold sound of a lie finally breaking apart. The 30 minutes I had granted them expired with the cold, mechanical precision of a stopwatch. In that half hour, the atmosphere in my mountain lodge shifted from a grotesque celebration to a frantic, humiliated retreat. Watching them was like observing a structural collapse in slow motion, where the brittle materials of their lies could no longer support the weight of reality. They didn't have enough suitcases for the haul of designer clothes and luxury goods they had brought to play house with, so they were forced to use black, heavy-duty trash bags I kept in the pantry. It was a pathetic sight. Grant's two younger brothers, who had been so boldly occupying my furniture, were now dragging those bulging plastic bags across the Carrara marble. The sound of plastic stretching and scraping echoing like a funeral dirge. They looked like common thieves caught in the night, their designer sneakers soaked through with the melting slush they had tracked inside. Grant himself was a ghost, moving with a jerky, uncoordinated haste, his eyes refusing to meet mine as he hauled a heavy trunk toward the door. Elena was the last to move. She stood by the kitchen island, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold her shattering identity together. Without my cashmere robe, she looked small, sharp, and dangerously fragile. She was wearing a cheap graphic t-shirt and a pair of leggings that had a visible hole in the seam, a stark contrast to the vintage wine she had been swilling moments before. The facade was gone. The millionaire investor was dead, and in her place was the girl who had spent 32 years expecting someone else to pay for the air she breathed. Deputy Miller stepped forward, his heavy boots thumping on the wood floor. "Time is up," he said, his voice devoid of any holiday cheer. "The storm is getting worse, and the visibility on the ridge is down to less than 50 feet. If you are not off this property in the next 5 minutes, I am taking the whole lot of you down to the station for the night." Grant's father, Arthur, stood by the open front door. The wind was whipping inside, carrying a fine spray of snow that began to settle on the foyer floor like salt on a wound. He looked at his son and Elena with a weary, crushing disgust. He was the only one who hadn't touched a drop of alcohol that night, his sobriety now a bitter curse as he realized he was the only one legally capable of navigating the icy descent. "I am ready," Arthur said, his voice trembling with a mixture of cold and shame. "Grant, get your mother to the sedan. Boys, get in the truck." Grant's mother, Martha, was weeping into a soaked tissue, her shoulders hunched as she hurried past me without a word. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the white void of the blizzard. Deputy Vance intercepted Grant at the threshold, holding up a breathalyzer unit. "Just so we are clear, Mr. Hayes, if I see you so much as touch the steering wheel of that SUV, you are going to jail. Your father is the only one driving tonight. You will sit in the passenger seat and stay quiet. Do you understand?" Grant nodded miserably, his bravado completely extinguished. He looked like a man who had realized that his $500,000 line of credit had just turned into a $500,000 noose. Elena was the last one at the door. As the wind howled through the opening, she turned back to me. Her face was a mask of jagged, desperate rage. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the heavy oak door, her knuckles white. "Hannah, please," she screamed, her voice competing with the roar of the storm. "You cannot do this. It is Christmas Eve. We are sisters. Do you remember what Mom said? You promised to take care of me? You are throwing your own flesh and blood into a blizzard for the sake of a rug and some wine. How can you live with yourself?" I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of their stay. I looked at the pizza boxes, the empty bottles, and the orange grease stain on my silk carpet. I didn't see a sister. I saw a predator that had mistaken my loyalty for a weakness to be exploited. "I lived with myself by working 80 hours a week while you slept until noon." "Elena," I said, my voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced her. "I lived with myself by building a career from nothing while you built a life out of my bank account. Our mother told me to make sure you didn't go astray. She didn't tell me to let you set my life on fire just to keep yourself warm." Elena's eyes filled with a fresh wave of tears. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a child who had finally been told no. "You are a cold, heartless bitch," she hissed. I hope you enjoy your silence. I hope it rots you from the inside out. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I simply watched as Deputy Miller placed a firm hand on her shoulder and guided her out into the night. The heavy oak door swung shut with a thud that felt final, a deep, percussive sound that echoed through the vaulted ceilings and seemed to settle into the very stone of the house. I heard the muffled roar of engines outside, the crunch of tires on packed snow, and then, slowly, the fading whine of the vehicles as they began the treacherous crawl down the mountain. Then, there was only the silence. I stood alone in the middle of the house. The red and blue lights had vanished, leaving only the soft, flickering orange glow of the fireplace. The quiet was absolute. Yet it wasn't the peaceful silence I had been dreaming of during my 18-month project in the city. It was a heavy, stagnant quiet, tainted by the lingering scent of their presence. I walked over to the windows and watched the white abyss. The blizzard was relentless, a wall of snow that erased the world. They were out there now, shivering in their cars, facing a reality that didn't include my protection. For the first time in 36 years, I wasn't wondering if Elena was warm enough or if she had enough money for dinner. I felt a strange, cold lightness in my chest, as if a structural load I had been carrying for a lifetime had finally been transferred to the ground. I turned back to the room. The sight was sickening. I couldn't sit. I couldn't rest. And I certainly couldn't sleep in a house that felt this violated. I needed to purge the space. I started with the coffee table. I gathered the empty bottles of beer and the $1,200 wine bottle Elena had drained, shoving them into a trash bag with a violent clatter. I grabbed the pizza boxes, the half-eaten wings, and the discarded paper plates, my movements becoming faster, more clinical. I wasn't just cleaning a room. I was performing a forensic sweep of a betrayal. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a bucket of warm water, a gentle soap, and a soft brush. I knelt on the floor by the $8,000 silk rug. I spent the next 45 minutes on my knees, meticulously dabbing at the orange grease stain. I focused on the texture of the fibers, the way the soap bubbled, and the slow, agonizing process of lifting the filth. Each stroke of the brush felt like a small act of reclamation. I wasn't just fixing a carpet, I was scrubbing Elena out of my sanctuary. As I worked, my mind drifted to the logistics of the coming days. Tomorrow was Christmas. The offices would be closed. But the automated systems I had triggered would be relentless. The bank, the leasing company, and the property managers would all be processing the digital death warrants I had issued. By the time the sun rose on the 26th of January, the life Elena knew would be a pile of ash. I stood up, my back aching, and looked at the rug. The stain was mostly gone, leaving only a damp patch that would dry in the heat of the fire. I moved to the fireplace and looked at the empty space above the mantel where the portrait of Grant's family had been. I went to the corner, picked up the portrait of my parents, and carefully wiped the dust from the glass with the hem of my shirt. I hung it back in its rightful place. My father's steady gaze and my mother's gentle smile seemed to anchor the room again. I felt a pang of grief, but also a sense of closure. I had kept my promise for as long as it was humanly possible. I sat down at the kitchen island, intending to drink a glass of water, when I noticed something tucked behind the designer toaster. It was a slim, silver tablet Elena's. She must have forgotten it in her frantic rush to pack. I picked it up, the screen flickering to life. She hadn't bothered with a passcode. Elena always assumed she was untouchable. I intended to just turn it off, but a notification on the screen caught my eye. It was an email from a site called Elite Heritage Auctions. My blood went cold. I opened the app and felt a surge of nausea. Elena had set up an account under a pseudonym, but the listings were unmistakable. There were high-resolution photos of the Louis XVI-style chairs from my dining room, the hand-carved 19th-century mantel clock that had belonged to my grandmother, and several pieces of original artwork I had collected over the years. The description for the clock read, "Family heirloom, moving sale, must go by end of January. Starting bid $5,000. She wasn't just living in my house, she was liquidating it. She was selling my history, my memories, and my hard-earned success to fund her delusions. She had likely been inviting potential buyers to the lodge while I was in the city, acting the part of the wealthy heiress, selling off her excess. My hands were shaking, not with sadness, but with a cold, architectural fury. I took photos of every listing with my own phone. I captured the account details, the timestamps, and the descriptions. At 1:15 in the morning, while the storm raged outside, I opened my laptop. I drafted an email to my lead counsel, a man who charged $750 an hour and was worth every penny. Subject: immediate filing, grand larceny and criminal fraud. I attached the screenshots of the auction listings, the security camera footage of Elena moving the furniture to take the photos, and the police report number from earlier that night. This is no longer just a family dispute. I wrote in the body of the email, "This is a premeditated attempt to embezzle and sell stolen assets valued at over $50,000. I want the full weight of the law brought down on her. No mediation, no settlements." I hit send. The soft whoosh of the outgoing mail was the most satisfying sound I had heard all year. I walked back to the Eames chair and sat down, looking at the fire. The lodge was clean now. The intruders were gone, their financial lives were hemorrhaging, and a criminal case was beginning to coil around Elena like a snake. I reached for my glass of water, my fingers steady. The 36-year-old architect, who had arrived 3 hours ago, was gone. In her place was a woman who had finally realized that some structures cannot be renovated. They have to be demolished so that you can finally see the view. The silence of the mountain was back, and this time, it was mine. By the time I drove my Range Rover back into the city on the morning of January 2nd, the mountains were a soft, white blur in my rearview mirror. I hadn't looked at my personal phone in 7 days. I had spent the week in a state of clinical detachment, drafting the preliminary sketches for a new cultural center in downtown Raleigh, while the snow settled into the crevices of the Blue Ridge Peaks. When I finally powered the device on as I crossed the city limits, the screen hummed with 98 missed calls and over 200 text messages. I didn't open a single one of them. I didn't need to. In the world of high-stakes architecture, we learn that once a structural collapse begins, the most dangerous place to be is near the wreckage. I walked into my office at Aetherist Design Group at 8:15 sharp. My assistant, Sarah, handed me a black coffee and a stack of mail, her eyes flickering with a silent, professional curiosity. She knew something had happened over the holidays, but she was too well trained to ask. The first call I took was from the property manager of the building on East 79th Street. "Miss Crestwood, this is Marcus from the management office," the voice said, sounding weary. "I am calling to confirm that the unit on the 14th floor has been secured. The 2-day notice expired yesterday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was unpleasant. Your sister and her husband refused to leave until the sheriff arrived. There was a fair amount of shouting in the hallway. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out at the city skyline, and the condition of the apartment." Marcus sighed. "They didn't take much besides their clothes. It looks like they tried to pack some of the smaller electronics, but the sheriff stopped them since those weren't on their list of personal property. We have changed the locks and redirected all mail. Where would you like us to send the bill for the deep cleaning? They left quite a mess." "Send it to my legal counsel," I said. "And Marcus, thank you for following the protocol exactly." I hung up and felt the first domino strike the ground. The apartment, worth $2,500 a month in market rent, was no longer their stage. They were now officially homeless in one of the most expensive cities in the world, with $0 in their shared bank account and a credit score that was currently hemorrhaging. By noon, the second domino fell. I received a brief formal email from a contact at the boutique consulting firm where Grant had been working as a junior sales associate, the job I had practically begged a former client to give him. "Hannah, just wanted to give you a heads up." The email read, "We had to let Grant go this morning, after you withdrew your professional recommendation last week. Our compliance department did a deeper dive into his initial background check, It turns out the 3 years of independent consulting he listed on his resume were completely fabricated. He was actually unemployed and receiving private transfers from a shell company we now know belongs to you. We cannot have that kind of dishonesty on our payroll, especially with the debt collectors already calling the front desk. I deleted the email. I had spent years polishing Grant's reputation, smoothing over his missed opportunities, and rewriting his resume to make him look like a rising star. I had been the plaster covering the cracks in his character. Now that I had stripped the plaster away, the rot was visible to everyone. Grant wasn't just unemployed, he was unhireable. The most visceral report came later that afternoon through a series of frantic, garbled voicemails from Elena's former college friends. Apparently, the high-end brunch spot in the city had been the site of the third domino. Elena had been meeting 2 of her socialite friends to complain about my cruelty, likely hoping one of them would offer her a guest room. The repossession team I had alerted on the 26th of December had finally caught up with her, right in the middle of a crowded street, in front of women who knew her only as the wealthy sister of a famous architect. The white luxury SUV was hitched to a tow truck. The $850 a month facade was dragged away while Elena stood on the sidewalk, screaming about her stolen car, only for the driver to produce the paperwork I had signed, proving the vehicle belonged to me. The humiliation was absolute. The wealthy investor, Elena Hayes, was exposed as a fraud in front of the only audience she actually cared about. But it was the 4th domino that surprised even me. My lawyer, the one I had emailed from the lodge, called me at 4 o'clock. "Hannah, we have a situation with the Hayes family," he said, sounding almost impressed. "Grant's parents, Arthur and Martha, have filed a civil suit against their own son." I sat up straight. A lawsuit. Apparently, Arthur did some digging into their retirement accounts after the disaster at the lodge. It turns out Grant had convinced them to invest $350,000, their entire life savings, into his firm, Aetheris Ridge Holdings. He told them the money was being used to buy the mountain lodge as a joint family asset. I closed my eyes for a second. The level of depravity was staggering. He had stolen from his own parents to fund the lie he was telling them. "They are suing him for fraud and elder abuse," my lawyer continued. "They have also cut off all contact with Elena. From what I hear, they blamed her for corrupting their son with her expensive tastes. The whole family has turned on itself. It is a bloodbath. Hannah." By the end of the first week of January, Elena had retreated to a $39 a night motel in a bleak suburb 40 miles outside the city. It was the kind of place with flickering neon signs and industrial-grade carpet that smelled of cigarettes, a place she wouldn't have even looked at from the window of a cab a month ago. She was living out of the black trash bags she had packed at the lodge. I received a frantic report from my credit monitoring service on Wednesday. Someone had tried to apply for 3 separate high-interest payday loans using my Social Security number and my maiden name as a cosigner. It was a clumsy, desperate move. I immediately contacted my legal team to issue a formal cease and desist and a notice of intent to prosecute for identity theft. I made sure the lenders knew that any contract signed under my name would be contested as a felony fraud. I was no longer a safety net. I was a brick wall. The final domino, however, was the one that truly defined the parasitic nature of their marriage. On Friday morning, my lawyer sent over a digital file. "Grant Hayes has filed for a unilateral, no-fault divorce," he informed me. I scanned the documents. Grant's filing was a masterclass in cowardice. He claimed that Elena had coerced him into a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and that he had been an unwitting victim of her financial manipulations. He was trying to distance himself from the fraud charges by pinning everything on my sister. The most cutting part was the financial disclosure. Grant was claiming he had 0 assets and was asking the court to hold Elena solely responsible for the $500,000 line of credit I had revoked. He was leaving her with the debt, the lawsuits, and the criminal investigation for the auction fraud, while he tried to crawl back to his parents' basement. I sat in the silence of my office, the sun setting behind the glass towers of the city. 1 week, It had taken exactly 7 days for the entire structure of their lives to turn to dust. Elena had called me 11 times that morning. I finally picked up the phone, not because I felt pity, but because I wanted to hear the sound of the collapse for myself. "Hannah," she whispered. Her voice was thin, reeking of a defeat she hadn't yet fully processed. "Grant is leaving me. He took the last $500 from the dresser and just walked out. He said this was all my fault. He said I ruined him." I stared at a blueprint on my desk, my fingers tracing the sharp, clean lines of a support beam. "He didn't ruin you, Elena. And you didn't ruin him. You both simply ran out of other people's lives to live. You have to help me," she sobbed. "I am in this horrible room. There are bugs. I don't have enough money for the bus back to the city. I am your sister. Hannah, please, I will do anything." I thought about the silk rug she had ruined. I thought about the grandmother's clock she had tried to sell for $5,000. I thought about the portrait of our parents she had hidden in the dark. "I have already done everything for you, Elena," I said, my voice devoid of any heat. "I spent 5 years and over $500,000 trying to buy you a character you didn't want. Now, you get to have exactly what you earned, but I have nothing." She screamed, her voice cracking. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was 5 o'clock. The work week was over. "Actually, Elena, you have something very valuable now," I said. "You have the truth. For the first time in your life, you are exactly who you are, without my money to hide behind. I suggest you get used to the view." I hung up the phone. I didn't block her number yet. I wanted the notifications to keep coming, each one a tiny, digital reminder that the demolition was proceeding exactly as planned. The financial dominoes had finished falling. Now, the real human cost was beginning to accrue. And for once in my 36 years, I wasn't the one paying the bill. The lobby of Aetherist Design Group is a cathedral of modern minimalism. It is a space of soaring 30-foot ceilings, frosted glass, and polished concrete that reflects the light with a clinical, unforgiving brilliance. It is a place designed to project power, order, and the quiet arrogance of success. On Tuesday morning, precisely 10 days after the storm in the Blue Ridge Mountains, that order was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in a multi-million-dollar architectural firm, the raw, unhinged screeching of a woman who had finally hit the bottom of her own abyss. I was stepping out of the elevator on the ground floor, my mind occupied with a structural tension issue on a new cantilevered museum project, when I saw the crowd, my colleagues, junior architects in their slim-fit charcoal suits, project managers with their tablets, and the high-end clients who usually paced the marble with hushed reverence were all frozen, staring at the center of the lobby. There, crumpled on the pristine floor like a pile of discarded laundry, was Elena. She looked 10 years older than the woman who had sipped my vintage wine just a week and a half ago. Her hair, usually blown out at a salon I paid for, was a matted, greasy nest. She was wearing a coat that looked like it had been pulled from a donation bin, and her skin had a sallow gray tint that spoke of cheap motel air and sleepless nights. When she saw me, her face contorted into a mask of theatrical agony. She didn't just walk toward me, she threw herself onto her knees, skidding across the concrete until she was inches from my boots. "Hannah," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls like a physical blow. "Please, everyone, look at her. Look at my sister, the great Hannah Crestwood. She is a millionaire. She builds monuments to her own ego while she kicks her own pregnant sister into the snow. She has taken everything from me, my home, my car, my marriage. She is a cold-blooded monster who cares more about her blueprints than her own blood." The silence that followed was thick with the scent of a public scandal. I could feel the eyes of my peers on me, people I had worked with for a decade, people whose respect I had earned through precision and grit. Elena was banking on my shame. She knew that in this world, reputation is the most delicate material, and she was trying to hammer a spike into mine. 2 security guards, heavy-set men in crisp uniforms, moved in to grab her arms. I raised a single hand, a sharp, silent command that made them pause. "Leave her," I said, my voice low and perfectly calibrated. It didn't tremble. It didn't carry a hint of the exhaustion that was gnawing at my bones. I looked down at her, not with anger, but with the same detached curiosity I would use to examine a termite infestation in a foundation. Elena looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and leaking fake. Practiced tears. "Hannah, please," she sobbed, clutching at the hem of my tailored trousers. "I have nothing. Grant is gone. The bank took the furniture. I am staying in a place where I don't even feel safe to close my eyes. How can you do this? How can you be so heartless?" I stepped back, just far enough that she couldn't touch me. "You aren't crying because you are sorry." "Elena," I said, making sure my voice carried to the back of the lobby. "To the junior associates who were recording this on their phones, you aren't crying for the sister you betrayed or the parents whose memory you insulted. You are crying because the well has finally run dry. You are crying because you have no one left to suck blood from, and the reality of your own uselessness is finally starting to settle in. You monster," she spat, her voice losing its sobbing edge and sharpening into a snarl. "I am your sister. You promised Mom." Mentioning our mother was her final mistake. It was the card she always played when her own hand was empty. But what Elena didn't know was that while she was hiding in that motel, I had been doing more than just working on blueprints. My legal team's investigation into her attempted auction of my belongings had opened a door into her past that I had never dared to look through. "Speaking of our mother, Elena," I said, reaching into my slim leather folio and pulling out a grainy black and white printout of a pawn shop ledger from 7 years ago. "Do you remember these?" Elena's eyes darted to the paper, her breath hitched. "The emerald earrings," I continued, "the gold locket with the photo of us as children, the diamond engagement ring that Dad had given Mom on their 10th anniversary. I spent 10 years believing those were lost in the move after the accident. I spent a decade mourning those pieces because they were the only physical connection I had left to the woman who gave us everything." I took a step closer to her, my shadow falling over her trembling form, but I found them last week. Elena, or rather, I found the record of who sold them. 3 weeks after the funeral, while I was working 3 jobs to pay off the medical bills and keep you in college, you were walking into a shop on the outskirts of the city and selling our mother's legacy for $6,000 so you could take a spring break trip to Cabo. The gasp from the crowd was audible. The victim on the floor seemed to shrink, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The greed that had defined her entire life was no longer a private family secret. It was a public record. You don't know what it was like." She stammered, her voice failing her. "I was grieving. I needed to get away. You were stealing." I corrected her. "You have been stealing from me, from our parents, and from your own in-laws for your entire adult life. You are a professional predator." "Elena, but the audit is over." I reached back into my folio and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery. It was a formal document, drafted by my accountants and verified by my legal team. I dropped it on the floor in front of her. "That is an itemized invoice," I said. "It covers the last 60 months, the rent on 3 different apartments, the lease on the SUV, the bail for Grant's first reckless driving charge, the $300,000 in credit card debt I settled to keep your name out of the courts. The total comes to exactly $500,000, $500,000 of my life, spent on the illusion of yours." Elena stared at the number on the paper, the zeros staring back at her like unblinking eyes. "I have written, paid in full across the bottom," I told her, "but that payment comes with a condition. Consider that $500,000 your severance package. It is the price I am paying to never have to hear your voice or see your face again." I looked at the security guards and nodded. "From this moment on, Elena Hayes, I have no sister. You are a stranger to me. My lawyers have already filed the paperwork for a permanent restraining order. If you come within 100 feet of me, this building, or my home, you won't be going back to a motel. You will be going to a cell." The security guards moved in then, their grip firm and final. They hoisted Elena to her feet. She tried to struggle, tried to let out one last scream of defiance. But the crowd of my colleagues didn't look at her with pity anymore. They looked at her with the cold, silent contempt reserved for a parasite that has finally been exposed. As they dragged her toward the heavy glass revolving doors, her heels clicking uselessly against the concrete, the lobby of Aetherist Design Group began to return to its natural state. The shouting faded, replaced by the humming of the climate control and the distant chime of the elevators. I stood there for a long moment, watching her disappear into the gray city air outside. I felt a strange sensation, a lack of weight. It wasn't the joy of a victory. It was the quiet, sterile relief of a successful demolition. The structure was finally down. The ground was clear. Sarah, my assistant, stepped forward and handed me a fresh coffee. She didn't say anything about the scene. She just looked at my tablet and whispered, "The board is waiting for the museum presentation in 10 minutes. Hannah." I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, bitter, and grounding. I straightened the lapels of my coat, checked the time on my watch, and turned toward the elevators. I have a museum to build. I said. The confrontation was over. The $500,000 debt was settled with the finality of a closed grave. As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the last of the outside noise, I realized that the only person left in my life was the one who had actually earned the right to be there. Me. By the middle of February, the city had turned into a monochrome landscape of gray slush and biting Atlantic winds. I watched the world from the 34th floor of the Aetherist Design Group headquarters, where the glass was thick enough to mute the roar of the traffic, but clear enough to reveal the cold reality of the streets below. My life had returned to its natural rhythm of structural calculations and client meetings. But the echoes of the demolition I had triggered on Christmas Eve were still reverberating through the legal and financial systems of the state. I didn't seek out news of the Hayes family, but when you are the one who pulled the cornerstone from a building, you don't need to go looking for the rubble. The rubble finds you in the form of police reports, legal filings, and the occasional, desperate whisper from the shadows of my former life. The first major piece of debris fell in the first week of February. Grant Hayes, the man who had spent 5 years pretending to be a titan of industry on my dime, had finally encountered a situation that his manufactured charisma couldn't fix. A debt recovery agent from the bank had arrived at his parents' driveway to serve a final notice regarding the $500,000 line of credit I had revoked. According to the police report, Grant had snapped. The ego that had been inflated by my bank account for half a decade couldn't handle the sight of a man in a cheap suit handing him a piece of paper that confirmed his insolvency. Grant had lunged at the agent, swinging a heavy brass paperweight he had stolen from my study during their stay at the lodge. He didn't just shout. He committed a felony. He was arrested on the spot for aggravated assault and battery because he had 0 assets, and I had withdrawn my status as his guarantor. No bondsman in the city would touch him. His bail was set at $50,000, a sum that might as well have been $50 million for a man whose credit cards were all frozen. Grant was currently sitting in a county jail cell, traded his designer flannel for an orange jumpsuit, awaiting a trial that would likely end in a multi-year prison sentence. The paper tiger had finally been torn to shreds by the very system he tried to manipulate. But the collateral damage was perhaps even more grim. Arthur and Martha, Grant's parents, were the silent victims of their son's parasitic greed. After the disaster at the mountain lodge, Arthur had discovered that Grant hadn't just invested their $350,000 retirement fund, he had liquidated it to pay off his gambling debts and the interest on his other failed ventures, to settle the mounting legal fees and the civil lawsuits brought by the bank. The elderly couple had been forced to do the unthinkable. They had put their family home of 30 years on the market. It sold in 4 days for $420,000, but after the debts were paid, and the lawyers took their cut, they were left with almost nothing. They had moved into a cramped, 1-bedroom rental in a part of the state where the crime rate was higher than the property value. They had officially disowned their son, but the bitterness of his betrayal was a debt they would be paying for the rest of their lives. Then there was Elena. My sister had discovered that without my name behind her, she was a non-entity. She had spent a decade believing she was an influencer and a creative soul. But the job market in the real world has no use for someone whose only skill is spending other people's money. She had tried to find work, driven by the cold reality of her $39 a night motel bill. She had lasted exactly 4 hours at a high-end coffee shop before she was fired for screaming at a customer who complained about her attitude. She had tried a retail position at a department store, but they had run a background check that flagged the pending investigation into her heritage auction fraud. By the middle of the month, she was blacklisted from every reputable business in the city. Her creative life had been reduced to scrubbing floors at a 24-hour diner, a job she quit after 2 days because the work was too hard and the grease ruined her manicure. The call came on a Tuesday night, just as a freezing rain began to pelt the windows of my apartment. I was sitting in my living room, the lights dimmed, looking at a scale model of the museum project. My phone buzzed on the mahogany table. It was an unknown number, but the area code was from the outskirts of the city, near the industrial district. I picked it up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Hannah. The voice was a jagged, shivering wreck of what it used to be. It was Elena, but the arrogance was gone. There was no wine-drunk confidence, no snarling entitlement. I could hear the wind whistling in the background, the hollow metallic echo of a public phone booth. Hannah, please, she sobbed. And this time, the tears sounded real. Not because she was sorry, but because she was suffering. It is so cold out here. I haven't eaten anything since yesterday morning. The motel kicked me out because I couldn't pay the $40 for tonight. I am standing at a gas station on the highway. I don't have a coat. I don't have anyone. I listened to the sound of her teeth chattering. I looked at the warmth of my fireplace, the security of my walls, and the life I had built with my own hands. The silence between us stretched out, a long, breathless void that felt like the drop from a skyscraper. We are sisters. Hannah, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the freezing air. We have the same blood. You cannot leave me like this. Mom would never forgive you. Please, just one last time. Give me enough for a room and a meal. I will go away forever. I promise. Just $100. That is all I need to survive the night. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I saw our mother's face. I saw the girl who had sold our mother's jewelry for a trip to Cabo. I saw the woman who had called me a parasite in my own home while her husband's family trashed my history. Elena, I said, my voice as calm and cold as the rain outside. Do you remember the estate lawyer who handled Mom's affairs after the accident? Why are you talking about lawyers? She wailed. I am freezing to death because I spent some time with him last week. I continued. I wanted to look into the small trust fund Mom left for you, the one that was supposed to be released when you turned 30. Do you remember why you never saw a cent of that money? Elena went quiet. The only sound was the static on the line and the rhythmic thud of the rain. You told me it was lost in the stock market crash, she muttered. You told me there was nothing left. No, I said. I told you that to protect you from the truth. The truth is that Mom knew you. Even at the end, she knew exactly who you were. She gave me discretionary power over your portion of the inheritance because she was afraid you would blow it all in a month. She told me to wait until you were financially responsible. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the distant, flickering lights of the highway. I realized a month ago that you were never going to be responsible. Elena, you were never going to be a normal person as long as you thought there was a safety net made of my soul. So, I made a decision. I took the remaining $85,000 of your inheritance, every cent that Mom had saved for your future, and I used my power as the trustee. What did you do? Elena's voice was a low, horrified hiss. I dissolved the trust. I said, I donated the entire amount to the Crestwood Legacy Foundation, a charity I just established in our mother's name. It provides housing and vocational training for women who have actually suffered. Women who were born with nothing and are trying to build a life. I had you declared financially incompetent in the context of that specific trust based on your history of fraud and the criminal charges you are currently facing for the auction theft. You are legally incapable of touching that money now. You gave my money away, she screamed, her voice hitting a pitch of pure, unadulterated madness. That was mine. You stole my last hope. You are a thief. No. Elena, I said, I saved it. That money is finally doing exactly what Mom wanted. It is taking care of people who deserve it. And as for you, I am doing exactly what she asked me to do in her final moments. I am making sure you don't go astray. How is this not going astray? I am homeless. I looked at the blueprint of the museum on my table. A building only stands if its foundation is solid. Your foundation was made of my labor and my guilt. Now that it is gone, you have to find a way to stand on your own 2 feet. Mom wanted me to take care of you. And I have realized that the best way, the only way to do that, is to let you be a normal person on your own. No more luxury cars, no more $500 dinners, no more silk robes, just you, the cold, and the reality of your own choices. I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't want to hear the curses or the desperate bargaining that I knew would come next. Good night, Elena, I said. I hope you find some shelter. But don't call this number again. The architect is finished with the project. I pressed the end call button and felt the finality of it settle into my bones. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or stagnant anymore. It was clean. It was the silence of a site that had been cleared of its rot, ready for the first spring thaw. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hands perfectly steady. The Hayes family was gone, scattered like dust in the wind of their own making. I was alone in my apartment, 36 years old, with a career that was soaring and a conscience that was finally, after a lifetime of carrying a sister's weight, completely at peace. The parasites had run out of host, and the host had finally learned how to breathe. The mountain air in mid-April was a different creature entirely from the jagged, freezing blade that had cut through me on Christmas Eve. As I drove up the winding private road toward my lodge, the world was bleeding into 1,000 shades of emerald and pale gold. The heavy, suffocating blanket of snow had surrendered to a frantic burst of life. Wildflowers were pushing through the damp earth, and the hardwoods were draped in a delicate, misty green. I pulled my car into the circular driveway at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, stopping precisely where the white SUV had once stood as a monument to my sister's greed. The driveway was clean now. There were no muddy tracks, no black trash bags, and no lingering scent of desperation. I stepped out of the car and breathed in the scent of damp pine and blooming azaleas. For the first time in 36 years, the air didn't feel heavy with the weight of someone else's expectations. I had spent the last 3 weeks coordinating a total architectural cleansing of the interior. I didn't just want the house cleaned. I wanted the memory of their presence surgically removed. I had hired a premium design firm and a crew of 12 specialists to strip the living room to its literal bones. I spent over $250,000 on the renovation. Every piece of furniture Grant and Elena had sat on, every rug they had stained, and every curtain that had absorbed their stale, deceitful breath was gone. I had them hauled away to a specialized disposal facility. I didn't even want to donate them, as if the very fibers were infected with their entitlement. The Eames chair where Elena had lounged in my stolen robe was replaced by a custom-sculpted teak lounger from a designer in Denmark. The silk rug I had spent 45 minutes scrubbing on my knees was replaced by a hand-knotted wool piece from the Atlas Mountains, costing me $12,000. The walls had been repainted in a shade called Alabaster Silence, a white so pure it felt like a fresh start. Even the lighting fixtures had been swapped for modern, minimalist sculptures that cast a clean, honest glow over the stone. I walked through the foyer, my heels clicking on the marble that had been professionally polished until it shone like a dark mirror. I stopped at the mantel. The family portrait of Grant's parents was long gone. Of course, my parents' portrait was back in its rightful place, but I had reframed it in a sleek, silver border that looked toward the future rather than clinging to the past. My phone chimed in my pocket. It was a final update from Robert, my lead counsel. I sat down at the new kitchen island and opened the digital file. It was the formal conclusion of the legal proceedings in Watauga County. Grant Hayes had been sentenced to 4 years in a state penitentiary for the assault on the debt collector and his various financial frauds. His parents, having lost their life savings, had moved into a small apartment 300 miles away and had officially filed for a permanent restraining order against their own son. Elena's fate was a different kind of prison. Because it was her first criminal offense and she had played the distraught wife card, she had avoided immediate jail time for the antique auction fraud. Instead, the judge had handed down a sentence of 750 hours of community service and 5 years of intensive financial probation. She was barred from opening any credit accounts or holding any assets over $500 without a court-appointed monitor. She was currently working 10 hours a day at a municipal waste sorting facility as part of her service, earning a sub-minimum wage stipend that barely covered her bus fare and the rent on a tiny shared room in a halfway house. She was officially a ward of the state she had tried to manipulate. I noticed a thick, cream-colored envelope sitting on the counter, delivered by the local post office earlier that morning. It was from the Raleigh Correctional Center. I recognized the jagged, frantic handwriting on the front. Elena. I didn't open it. I didn't need to read her latest plea for mercy, her new excuses, or her desperate claims that she was finally changing. I knew the anatomy of a parasite too well. They only change their host, never their nature. I walked over to the fireplace, where a small, controlled fire was crackling softly to take the chill off the mountain air. Without a second of hesitation, I tossed the unopened letter into the heart of the flames. I watched the paper curl, turn black, and vanish into ash in less than 10 seconds. It was the most satisfying architectural demolition I had ever performed. I went down to the wine cellar at 6 o'clock that evening. The space felt different now, organized, cool, and silent. I had restocked the shelves with a new collection, but as I was organizing a crate of vintage Bordeaux, I noticed a small wooden box tucked behind a stone pillar in the very back of the room. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, clearly having been missed by Elena during her looting spree because it was hidden behind a stack of empty crates. I pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside was a single bottle of champagne, a 1988 vintage, the year I was born. Taped to the side of the bottle was a weathered, yellowed piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my mother's. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. For the day you are truly free. The note read, I knew you would carry her as long as you could. Hannah. But I also knew you were the only one strong enough to finally let go. Drink this when the house is quiet and your heart is light. I love you. Mom. I stood in the dim light of the cellar, the bottle cool in my hands, and felt a sob rise in my throat. But it wasn't a sob of grief. It was a release. My mother hadn't left me with a burden. She had left me with a mission. She had known that Elena's weakness would eventually become a fire that only I could put out. She had been waiting for me to choose myself. I took the bottle upstairs and opened it. The pop of the cork echoed through the silent, beautiful rooms of the lodge. I poured a glass and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was dipping below the ridge, painting the valley in streaks of violet and burning orange. The trees were swaying in a gentle spring breeze, and the world looked vast, clean, and full of possibility. I took a sip of the champagne. It was crisp, bright, and perfect. Revenge is a word people use when they want to describe an act of anger. But what I had done wasn't about anger. It was about restoration. The most devastating thing you can do to a person who lives off your light is to simply turn the light off. By taking away the luxury, the cars, the homes, and the safety net. I hadn't just punished Elena and Grant. I had forced them to meet the one person they had spent their entire lives running away from themselves. I didn't need to strike them. I just needed to stop holding them up. Watching them fall was simply the natural law of gravity asserting itself. I reached for my phone and looked at the screen. There were no missed calls, no frantic texts, no emergencies. I pressed the power button and watched the screen go black. I set the device face down on the teak table and turned my back on the digital world. The silence of the mountain was no longer a void to be feared. It was a symphony of my own making. I stood there for a long time, watching the stars begin to prick through the velvet sky over the Blue Ridge Mountains. I thought about the skyscraper I was building in the city, the museum I was designing, and the 1,000 other structures I would create in the years to come. But this house was my greatest achievement. It was a structure built on the ruins of a betrayal, reinforced with the steel of my own boundaries, and finished with the beautiful, hard-earned clarity of a woman who no longer owed the world anything. I looked at the portrait of my parents on the mantel and, for the first time in 5 years, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph or a smile of spite. It was the simple, quiet smile of a woman who was finally, completely, at home. The world has no room for parasites, especially when the host learns to say no. Thank you for listening to this journey of reclamation and justice. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from and share your thoughts on Hannah's final decision. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Family Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners who believe in the power of standing your ground.